the Sioux Indian giant of the Korean War. The Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War, often being overshadowed by other conflicts such as World War II and the Vietnam War. In spite of this obscurity, there are many acts of heroism that deserve recognition. One of these came from Woodrow Keeble, the first full-blooded Dakota to earn the Congressional Medal of Honor. Woodrow Wilson Keeble, nicknamed Woody, was born on May 16, 1917, on the Siston-Wapton Reservation in Waubay, South Dakota. Early in his childhood, he would move to Wapton, North Dakota. He and his parents were full-blooded members of the Siston-Wapton-Oyate Nation of the Santee Dakota tribe. Keeble was enrolled in the Wapton Indian School, now called the Circle of Nations School, a boarding school where he was given a strictly disciplined upbringing. While there, he excelled in athletics, his endeavors aided by his large and robust size. In particular, he stood out playing baseball, especially pitching, and led his amateur team to a 10-0 record, something that drew the attention of talent scouts for the Chicago White Sox. Any chances of a professional baseball career ended on December 7, 1941. With the United States at war, Keeble enlisted in the North Dakota National Guard and was soon assigned to the 164th Infantry Regiment. After training in Louisiana, the 164th was shipped to the South Pacific, and by October 1942 they reinforced the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, the first Army unit to land on the island. Due to his powerful frame, Keeble was assigned to carry his unit's BAR, or Browning automatic rifle, a weapon designed to provide heavy fire support. Keeble excelled in this role, wielding the weapon with considerable accuracy, earning admiration from his comrades. Because of his distinctive weapon and his large size, he also drew the attention of the enemy, who would specifically target him. During the fighting, Keeble's ammunition bearer was killed, a loss that affected him deeply. In subsequent fighting, he refused to use another ammunition bearer, carrying the extra ammo himself rather than risk another person on his behalf. Keeble also earned a reputation for bravery, often scouting ahead of his unit. One of his squad mates stated that Keeble would very often, quote, go in front of patrols and kill enemies before his unit would get there. At Guadalcanal, he earned a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, and was also awarded for his participation in the landings in the Philippines. After the war, he returned to Wapton, where he married Nettie Owen Robertson and began a teaching career at the Wapton Indian School where he had attended as a child. In 1950, the outbreak of the Korean War led to the reactivation of the 164th, and Keeble was once again called to service. When his commanding officer was ordered to select sergeants to deploy to Korea, he asked the men to draw straws, the most fair way to choose who would be sent overseas. Keeble marched to his CO and deliberately drew a short straw, stating, "Someone has to teach these kids how to fight." He was assigned to G Company, 2nd Battalion, 19th Infantry Regiment, 24th Infantry Division, and was deployed to the Korean Peninsula. There, Keeble once again earned a reputation as a fierce soldier, stealthily approaching enemy positions and destroying them at close range, once again wielding his BAR with devastating effect. He worked his way up the ranks quickly, earning the rank of Master Sergeant. Keeble's greatest accomplishment would take place in October of 1951. The 24th Division was participating in Operation Nomad Polar, an offensive against North Korean and Chinese forces in the Kumsong region of North Korea, an area of rocky, mountainous terrain that favored defenders. Starting on October 15, Keeble and his unit fought in near constant combat for almost a week. During this time, G Company suffered heavy casualties as they tried to force the enemy from their well-fortified positions. It was on October 20th, 1951, when Keeble would perform his most heroic action of his military career. Keeble was in command of the support platoon of Company G when the unit was ordered to take Hill 765, a heavily fortified but strategically vital location. With Keeble's platoon looking on, the 2 other platoons of G Company launched their assault against the Chinese-held positions. Due to the terrain and the fierce enemy opposition, they were repulsed, suffering heavy casualties. The main resistance from Hill 765 was in the form of 3 machine gun nests that had the men pinned. Acting on his own initiative, Keeble joined the pinned men and were better able to assess the situation. Not wanting to risk further lives, he advanced alone, crawling as low as he could towards the closest enemy machine gun nest. When he was close enough, he pulled the pin of a grenade and tossed it at the enemy position. With the skill he acquired as a pitcher, he lobbed the explosive like a baseball with pinpoint accuracy, even though it was almost 50 meters away. Now, under fire from the remaining positions, he advanced, using another grenade, which he again threw with astonishing accuracy, destroying the position. With the two positions eliminated, the remaining Chinese forces on Hill 765 turned all their attention to Keeble, opening up with a fusillade of concentrated machine gun and rifle fire, as well as a storm of their own grenades. The Chinese defenders desperately tried to hold off the one-man assault. Undeterred by the opposition against him, as well as the numerous wounds he had suffered, Keeble advanced against the third machine gun nest, and using his remaining grenades, as well as fire from his BAR, he cleared the third nest. With these three strongpoints eliminated, the rest of G Company was able to advance. Because of the heavy fighting, all of the other officers had been killed or severely wounded, leaving Master Sergeant Keeble in effective command over the entire company. He directed his men to pour heavy fire on the remaining enemy trench lines, which buckled and eventually broke under the onslaught, allowing the remainder of G Company to secure the vital objective, though it was nightfall by the time the position fell. Master Sergeant Keeble was seen the next day, having wandered into the American encampment, covered in blood, and somewhat dazed due to his wounds, but still requesting more men to continue the advance. He flat out refused medical attention until his men forced him to visit an aid station. He was covered in so many wounds that one soldier said he'd looked like he'd been hit by buckshot. During the course of his one-man assault against the Chinese positions, he suffered 2 bullet wounds to his left arm, a grenade blast that almost blew off his nose, and at least 83 separate fragments were removed from the rest of his body. This was on top of another wound, a glancing bullet to his ear that punched a hole in his helmet he had sustained a few days before. In spite of his injury, he refused to be evacuated and stayed with his unit for another 9 months, fighting throughout the Korean peninsula. He would eventually be shipped home and was honorably discharged from the Army in August of 1952. After the war, Keeble returned home and continued his teaching career. Shortly after his return, however, he would contract tuberculosis, which would require the surgical removal of one of his lungs. He would suffer a stroke shortly afterwards, which left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak. His wife would pass away a short time later from cancer. He would remarry in 1967, though he would remain unable to speak for the rest of his life. Keeble would pass away on January 28, 1982. For his actions in Korea, Master Sergeant Woodrow Wilson Keeble would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, in addition to 2 Silver Stars, the Bronze Star with V device, the Combat Infantryman's Badge, and 4 Purple Hearts. After his death, his family embarked on a lengthy campaign to have his award for actions in Korea upgraded to the Medal of Honor, their efforts joined by all 4 senators of North and South Dakota. After reviewing the case, the U.S. Army agreed, and on March 3, 2008, Master Sergeant Woodrow Wilson Keeble was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, which was presented by George W. Bush to his stepson, Russell Hawkins, making Keeble the first full-blooded member of the Dakota Nation to earn the highest honor the American military can bestow. In addition, the Circle of Nations School Gymnasium, Veterans of Foreign Wars Post 4324, and a section of U.S. Highway 12 near Waubay, South Dakota, all bear his name. Perhaps the greatest honor, though, was the admiration from the men he fought alongside. One of the men he served with on Guadalcanal stated simply, "The safest place to be was right next to Woody."
Jakob Nacken, the giant German soldier, World War II. Jakob Nacken was born in 1906 in Dusseldorf, Germany. It was not surprising that he grew up to be incredibly tall, as both his mother and father were over 6 feet tall. In fact, tallness seemed to run in the family. Jakob's younger sister and brother both grew up to be over 6 feet, and his older brother was a massive 6 foot 7 inches. Jakob grew to be the true giant of the family, growing to a colossal 7 foot 3 inches. Though some newspapers would claim his true height was nearer to 7 foot 8. When Jakob was a teenager, there was mass unemployment in post-World War I Germany. After World War I, Germany was forced to pay for the material losses, which threw the country into a violent economic crisis. So young Jakob took advantage of his unique appearance to find a job in the show business and leave the country, traveling with a German traveling circus around Europe. At first, he was known by the stage name of Uranus, after the Greek god of the sky. But then he was more and more billed as the Giant from the Rhineland, and would spend nearly the next 20 years traveling all over Europe, often headlining as Germany's tallest man. He married a 5 foot 8 inch tall girl from Belgium and seemed to be content with his minor celebrity status as a comical curiosity attraction in a circus show. He was often dressed as a cowboy or gentleman in a top hat and tails for the crowd's amusement in his shows, and he was accompanied by a child dressed as an adult in order to exaggerate his height even further. Nacken would have to wear size 17 boots as an adult and would constantly get bruises on his head from hitting the tops of doorways. But in 1939, Jakob cut short his visit to the New York Trade Fair, a year-long event showcasing the finest in business innovation, and returned home to join the army as Germany prepared to go to war. Like many Germans at the time, he returned from abroad out of patriotism rather than ideology. There's no proof that Jakob was ever a Nazi or agreed with their radical views. Once he joined the German army, he officially became their tallest soldier. By this time, he was 34 years old, which was considered to be too old at the start of the war for frontline service in the infantry. So he was assigned to an anti-tank crew and spent the war doing garrison duty, far away from the action. He never saw frontline service during those years, so his biggest challenge was to find a pair of trousers that fit him. But in the summer of 1944, he found himself stationed on the defensive line surrounding the strategically important French port of Calais. The reason this port was so important was that it was only around 21 miles from the English coastline, and therefore the most obvious point for any Allied invasion of Europe. When D-Day began on June 6th along the shoreline of Normandy, several hundred miles away, Hitler first thought it was a trick and that the real invasion would still happen at Calais. In fact, the Allies encouraged Hitler into believing this through a series of deceptions in Operation Bodyguard. So Jakob remained in the heavily fortified bunkers waiting for an attack that never happened. A month later, he and his anti-tank crew found themselves along with the rest of the Calais garrison cut off and surrounded by the Allied forces. Jakob's units surrendered without a fight to an advancing Canadian brigade. Ironically, he was pictured surrendering to a corporal named Eldon Bob Roberts, who was just 5 foot 3 inches tall. This made headline news in both American and British newspapers and newsreels at the time, as Jakob towered over the Canadian soldier who was a full 2 feet smaller than him. It was only in 2010 that the giant man in the photograph was identified as being Jakob Nacken. Jakob was subsequently sent to Britain as a prisoner of war, where he remained for over a year. After being found to have no involvement in any war crimes, and with the war being over, he was released. He returned to his hometown of Dusseldorf in Germany, but not to the family home as it had been destroyed in an Allied bombing raid during the war. Thankfully, none of his family had been killed. He spent the next 4 years doing various jobs, including work as a receptionist in the local British Officers Club. But in 1949, he and his wife decided to leave Germany and immigrated to America, where most of his family had gone to live. He was sponsored by his father's employer there, a local car dealership, and at first lived with his sister in New Jersey, who had moved there just after the war. He was keen to get back into circus life and got himself a job with an American traveling circus, where he was wrongly billed as the tallest man in the world. But now Jakob was in his mid-40s and was disillusioned with circus life, complaining about the long hours and being away for extended periods from his wife, who had stayed behind in their apartment in New York. So he left the circus after just 1 season and started a new job as a novelty Santa Claus. Now he was advertised as being the tallest Santa in the world. Jakob then went on to appear on several television shows and made a living under the stage name of Germany's Long Jake for the next 10 years. His last engagement was starring in the Broadway version of Ripley's Believe It or Not. Then he chose to retire from show business at the age of 53. Though he did still occasionally make public appearances. For instance, in 1961, Jakob dressed in the white uniform and hat of a chef, helping a department store celebrate its anniversary sale by serving free food to customers. Jakob later returned to Germany and lived to the ripe old age of 81, dying in 1987. This may have been surprising because of his height. Though Jakob was incredibly tall, he was not by far the tallest man. This title officially belonged to an American called Robert Wadlow from Missouri. He was as tall as Jakob by the time he was 13.